At the moment, we're joined in the studio with Dave Hale from the Sheppey Horticultural Society. Dave, if you're planning to go out and do some gardening, what can you be getting on with over the next couple of weeks?
Sorry, apologise for the laughing, but the weather comes back to the weather.
Well,
always
yeah.
the weather, isn't it? Yeah. Put it this way, it's definitely a very busy time of the year, weather notwithstanding, and it's made even busier this year by those weather delays, actually. What I think you really need to get down to the business is you've got to plan the garden or the plot that you're actually going to put together this year. Things change from year to year in a garden and or an allotment. Clear away the old and dead plant stuff, compost it if it's suitable for composting. Use your already composted, rotted down material on your garden and dig it into the ground if it's not too heavy, if the ground's not too heavy, not the compost, if the ground's not too heavy. In that case, you could also, if it is too heavy, then you could leave it on the top of the ground around the plants as a mulch or a feed. It also frees up your compost bins for this year's material as well, because by now that should have rotted down very nicely. Worms, of course, them being near the surface with all this wet that we've been having, many more worms are just under the surface of the soil, so they will help to take that compost down into the soil for the roots to feed off. Prune when necessary, cut back dead, untidy, crossing branches. What you're trying to do is to let light into the centre of the plant. For instance, small things like some small fruit trees, for instance, autumn raspberries, cut those now right down to the ground, because they will fruit again. They'll come again and they will fruit again this time. But in the autumn of this year. Very important, you should really think about cleaning and disinfecting any plots. I've got plots on the brain tonight, Daniel, I apologise. Any pots that you'll be using again this year, and that will literally cut down the risk of infection. Clean and sharpen your tools. Make sure they're in good working order. I may have said this already this evening, but sharp knives are safer than blunt ones around the garden, because it means you don't have to exert too much pressure, and it's so much easier and cleaner. Tip out the plants that are overwintered in pots, for instance, even those that have been in your greenhouse. Replace the soil and pot up again with fresh compost, fresh soil. You need to look for the grubs, for instance the vine weevil that's overwintered in the soil, and destroy. And also check for slugs and snails that have hidden in the pots, because they have been hibernating in there for quite some time. Check those mollusk hiding places in the garden, remove them and destroy. I moved one very large pot that I have in the garden, and I counted 50 plus snails hiding underneath it. They obviously have to be got rid of. So check in those hidden places in the garden. They're just waiting to eat your young, fresh plants. They will gravitate towards the young stuff, that which you've assiduously grown on and carefully tended and kept well and warmed up to this particular point, and for the next week or so, or next couple of weeks or so. So check for those nasty little pests that are there. If you want, of course, there are a lot of birds around at the moment, so those kinds of things will feed thrushes, for instance. They go absolutely ape for snails.
Dave, looking ahead a bit more to the future, what can you be getting on with in the garden and the allotment over the next couple of months?
What might you be getting on with? Yes, exactly. I think, again, I have to repeat that because of this year's weather delays, it's more of the same of what we've already talked about and what you can be doing over the next couple of weeks, in effect. But I suppose you could be really looking at those horrible things called weeds, those perennial weeds, which always come up much quicker, much faster, much more prolifically than you can actually deal with on this particular case. Weeding and hoeing to keep those weeds in check, certainly those with long tap roots, to get those out as quickly as you possibly can before the ground hardens and they actually do root themselves really right in. When those roots have dried out, don't forget to add them to the compost heap, but make sure that the roots are dead before you actually do it, because they will re-sprout in your compost heap and you've got the same problem coming back again. Pot on those plants that will be planted out much later, and we're talking about a couple of months, a few weeks to a couple of months here. Pot those plants on that will be planted out much later, such as things like tomatoes. Succession sow vegetables. That's difficult to say, actually. Succession sow. Vegetables such as peas, brassicas, lettuces, radishes, other catch crops that are the kind of thing that's going to feed you and your family throughout the summer and the autumn. Sometime in June you might want to start digging up those delicious early potatoes if you've actually grown them, or even if you've grown them in sacks or in containers, in effect.
Yep.
Grow those up. When the first flowers appear, there should be some edible tubers underneath those. They're not going to be huge because you don't want new potatoes to be, or first early potatoes to be that big anyway. But there's nothing better or fresher than going out into the garden and sort of rooting around in a compost bag, or going out on the allotment and digging up those potatoes which you're going to need over the weekend, or you're going to need for your next meal. Something else you might want, gardeners or allotmenteers or vegetable growers might think about, for interest, try growing something different this year. Many of the more unusual or unlikely plants are now suitable for this country's climate, and we won't get into climate change or anything like that because it's a whole subject on its own, ecological subject on its own. But things like kiwi fruit and the other types of berry which are now being advertised, grapes.
Yep.
A couple of vines in my own garden, for instance, and they are very, very sweet. The birds get the outside grape, or from the outside vine, but I get the ones inside the greenhouse. I jealously guard those, thank you very much. Different coloured tomatoes, for instance, just something different which keeps the interest turning over. There are all kinds of weird and wonderful shapes and colours of tomatoes out there. You can astound your friends by giving them a perfectly ripe green tomato. Have a look at their faces first of all as you eat one. They might pucker. There you go. Carrots, for instance, there are white carrots and there are purple carrots. Don't just have to grow the ordinary same every year carrot, the orange carrot. Sorry?
Things you don't think of.
Yeah, absolutely. Just it keeps the interest up. Let's try something a bit different this time. I may have said this before, but the allotment, the guy or the chap who has the allotment next door to us stood behind my wife one day and said, "And now what are you newcomers trying?" And it was great, because you were able to talk about what you were actually going to put in and what you were actually going to try as a newcomer. And you might just influence some of the elder people, people who've been doing it for much longer. Other vegetables, for instance, there's a very popular vegetable at the moment called celeriac.
Right.
Which looks very ugly. It's a dirty sort of root, actually. What it is, it's a root which bulbs out.
Right.
Looks a bit like celery, that kind of thing. But it's a very, very useful vegetable. It's growing in popularity, and it's a great doer as a vegetable as well. You can eat it raw, grated, cooked, mashed with potato. You can put it in salads, and you can use it as a winter substitute for celery, that kind of thing. It's one of those hardy things which you can just put in and leave alone, because they are very hardy. Look out for those kinds of vegetables and those kinds of flowers, different types of thing as well. Also, I would suggest that people look at what's been successful last year and what you think might be successful this year, and decide if you want to persevere with a particular plant. It might not be good, but do you want to carry on with it, or do you want to try it in a different place, for instance? But mostly, I think, even though everything is late, enjoy it. Gardening shouldn't be painful. Plan it and take it at your own pace. Next couple of months, obviously, will be crucial, but pacing it will be vital, I think.
We are joined with Dave Hale